Book of Ezekiel, Part 7. Each person is a temple of God. Rebuild the temple, not build it anew. The new Israel in Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 1 to chapter 48 verses 35. The closing section contains an architectural sketch of the temple complex in Jerusalem. A description of restored worship in the temple, chapter 43 verses 1 to chapter 44 verses 3. The laws regarding the temple personnel and practices, chapter 44 verses 4 to chapter 47 verses 12. And the boundaries for a apportionment of the land, that is chapter 47 verses 13 to chapter 48 verses 35. These chapters are idealized vision of the restoration of a new Israel to the homeland compared with chapters 34, 36 and 37. Renewed life is now rightly centered on the temple, and the name of the new city is appropriately The Lord is Here. The new temple, chapter 40 verses 1 to 5. The man with a measure. Only one date, that is April 28, 573 BCE, verse 1, appears in chapters 40 to 48. On this day, Ezekiel is transported, that is compared to chapter 8, verses 3, to a high mountain in the land of Israel, where he sees a divine vision of a city being rebuilt. He observes a celestial man at the gate of the city with two measuring devices in his hand, a linen cord and a measuring rod. The divine messenger explained that he is Ezekiel's guide and cautions the prophet to pay close attention to all that he is to see. Then the guide proceeds to measure the width and the height of a 101 by 2 foot high outer wall that surrounds the temple. Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 6 to 16. The east gate. God is always considered to be in the east. Beginning at the east gate, which is the gate through which God departed the city, in chapter 10 verses 19, the guide climbs its steps. There are most likely 7 steps that is mentioned in chapter 40 verses 22 and then 26, and measures the temple's threshold or entrance hall, which is about 10.5 feet long, verse 6. Then he goes along into the long corridor that is flanked on each side by 3 10.5 foot square room like recesses, verse 7. At the end of the corridor of the gateway is another threshold or entrance hall, which is also 10.5 feet long, verse 7, and this symmetrically entrance way leads to a roomy vestibule about 14 by 35 feet, which opens onto the outer court of the temple. Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 17 to 19, the outer court. There are 30 rooms that occupy the north, south, east, and a pavement in front of these rooms connects the 3 sides of the outer court. Verse 19 fixes the distance between the outer and the inner east gate as 100 cubits, a distance of 175 feet. Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 19 to 23 and 24 to 27, the north gate and the south gate. Built to the north and the south outer walls are the 2 gates, identical in construction with the east gate, verses 6 to 16. Steps, the threshold, the corridor flanked by 3 rooms, and another threshold leads to the vestibule. As decorative features, each of the gate structures have recessed windows, palm tree reliefs on the jabs and the pilasters, and a rectangular column set into walls as an ornamental motif. Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 28, 29 to 31, 37. The gates of the inner court, the guide takes Ezekiel across the outer courtyard to measure the south, the east and the north gates in an inner wall. These gates are duplicates of the outer gates, except that these vestibules are on the outside of the gate structure so that they face the vestibules of the outer gates. The only difference in these reverse structures in the inner wall is that they have 8 steps, not 7, compared to verses 31, 34, 37 and 22 and 26 leading to them. Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 38 to 47, side rooms. Verses 38 to 39, is not clear exactly which gate contains the described sacrificial equipment. Perhaps the vestibules of all 3 inner gates are furnished with a room for washing the burnt offerings. The requirements of Leviticus chapter 1 verses 9 and verses 13, and 2 tables on each side upon which the slaughtered sin offerings and guilt offerings, that is chapter 45 verses 13 to 17. Now present temple has a dome which is built in 17 BC and demolished twice, and it is rebuilt. Moses and David not allowed by God to build a temple. The glory of God or Yahweh is in the Ark of the Covenant till Ezekiel's time, and then later it came back in Ezra's time. From verse 40 to the end of this section, Ezekiel sees 12 tables which seem to be described from the perspective of the north gate. According to verse 42, tables stand on each side of the outer wall of the vestibule of the inner gate, which most likely means that these 4 tables are in the outer court at the foot of the steps leading up to the north inner gate. According to verse 41, another 4 tables which are used for slaughter stand in the vestibule of the inner gate, also described in verse 39. Verse 42 to 43 describe four small cut stone tables which are intended to hold the instruments of slaughter and are most likely located near the slaughter tables on either side of the vestibule. Verses 44 to 46 explain the two rooms occupy the inside of the inner court wall beside the north and the south gateways. These rooms face each other, though it is not clear whether they are located to the right or to the left of the gates. The room by the north gate is for the use of the priests who care for the temple. The room by the south gate is for the priests who sacrifice at the table. Zadokites, according to chapter 44, verses 15 to 21. Solomon's temple, a lot of focus on the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the inner court is next measured as a perfect square, about 175 feet square, and the altar is described as standing in front of the temple, verses 47. Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 48 to 41, verses 15, the temple building. From the inner north gate, the guide next takes Ezekiel across the inner court to the vestibule of the temple building. 10 steps led up to the temple vestibule, which measures about 35 by 21 feet. The exterior of the vestibule area is described as featuring wall pillars, pilasters, two columns beside the jabs when we compare with 1 King chapter 7 verses 15 to 22, and a wide doorway, chapter 40 verses 48 to 49. Beyond the doorway is the nave, a room that measures about 35 feet wide by 70 feet deep. Chapter 41 verses 1 to 2. Ezekiel remains in this area while the heavenly guide proceeds to measure the Holy of Holies, a 35-foot square room, that is chapter 41 verses 3 and 4. The architecture details of measurement taken in this chapter 41 verses 5 to 15 are obscure. The guide first measures the wall of the temple, then 90 rooms built in 3 stories outside the temple with some kind of staircase connecting them, and finally a large structure behind the temple that is simply called the building. That is chapter 41 verses 12. Here there is structure of stones, and there are less details of kitchens and other dining rooms, etc. The temple interior, Ezekiel chapter 41 verses 15 to 26. This section resumes the description of the outer vestibule and the inner nave of the temple, where Ezekiel was left standing in chapter 41 verses 1. High windows allow light to enter the nave. The ornamental wood carvings of palm trees and two shaped cherubs, each with a human and a lion face, cover the wood paneled walls of the nave and the vestibule, verses 15 to 20. A 5 foot 3 inch high, 3.5 foot square table stands before the entrance to the Holy of Holies, verse 22, as compared to 1 Kings chapter 6 verses 21. And two sets of double doors decorated with the same design as that on the wall separate the vestibule from the nave and the nave from the Holy of Holies, that is verses 23 to 25. Ezekiel chapter 42 verses 1 to 14, the outer structure. This section is extremely difficult to interpret. Apparently, the guide takes Ezekiel to a square area behind the west end of the temple building, where he measures two building complexes on the south and the north side of the western square. These buildings serve as sacristies for the priests. Here they cut the sacred meals, store the cereal, sin and guilt offerings, and vest for the temple activities. Ezekiel chapter 42 verses 15 to 20 is measuring the outer court. The guide takes Ezekiel from the nave to the outer east gate, and there begins the final measurements of the external east, north, south and west walls. The perimeter of the exterior walls forms the square 500 cubits, or about 875 feet on side. The purpose of this outer wall is to separate the holy area of the temple complex from its profane surroundings. Restoration of the temple. Ezekiel chapter 43 verses 1 to 9, the return of the Lord. When full measurements have been completed, a guide takes Ezekiel to the east gate. The prophet sees the return of Lord's glory to the reconstructed temple. God, who had departed the temple on the throne chariot by the east gate as sign of judgment in chapter 11 verses 22-23, now returns through the same gate as sign of restoration, chapter 43 verses 1 to 5. Ezekiel is so overwhelmed, falls to his face, that is chapter 1 verse 28, but the Spirit takes him to the inner court, where God speaks to the prophet, promising to dwell in the midst of Israel forever, verses 7, 8 and 9. Ezekiel chapter 43 verses 10 to 12, the law of the temple. God instructs Ezekiel to describe the measurements and the design of the temple, and to teach the house of Israel the law or Torah, that is the instruction of the temple, that the whole surrounding area on the mountain top shall be most sacred. Ezekiel is charged with the priestly duty of making known to the people the Torah about God's possession of this high mountain, when we compare chapter 40 verses 2 and the divine presence which sets this area apart as holy. Israel is to be ashamed of its sins in the face of the majesty of God. Ezekiel chapter 43 verses 13 to 27, the altar. Ezekiel received detailed instructions about the dimension of the consecration of the altar. The altar of the burnt offering describes a large structure, 18 cubits square at its base, with successive layers 16, 14 and 12 cubits square, verses 13 to 17. At each of the four corners of the top layers are horns, vertical protrusions about 40.4 inches high, verses 15. Traditionally, these were places of utmost sanctity and refuge, that is Exodus chapter 21 verses 13, chapter 27 verses 2, chapter 29 verses 12, and 1 King chapter 1 verses 50 and chapter 2 verses 28. In the elaborate 7-day ritual, the Levitical priests are to consecrate this altar to God by ritually sacrificing young bulls, unblemished she goats, and rams, and by scattering salt. That is verses 18 to 27. The closed gate, Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 1 to 3. The heavenly guide takes Ezekiel from the inner court, that is chapter 43, verse 5, to the outer east gate, which has been closed. The guide explains that this gate is to remain perpetually shut, a sign that God had returned to the temple through it. Only the prince may sit in the vestibule of this gate structure where he eats his sacrificial meal. The new law, Ezekiel chapter 44 verses 4 to 9, the admission to the temple. Next, the guide leads Ezekiel to the inner court, verse 4, and he compare it with chapter 43 verse 5, where the Spirit took him to the same place. The prophet observed God's glory filling the temple, once again falls to his face when we compare with chapter 43 verse 3. In this manner, closely dependent on chapter 40 verses 4, the guide urges Ezekiel, listen closely, all he will hear about the statutes and law of God's temple in verse 5. The house of Israel is charged as a rebellious house. When we compare it, chapters 2, 12, 17 verse 12, and chapter 24 verse 3. So thus we have that in the past they admitted foreigners to a service in the sanctuary in verses 6, 7 and 8. The first law of the restored temple prohibits foreigners from entering the sanctuary, verses 9. Ezekiel chapter 44 verses 10 to 14, the Levites. The next regulation limits the service of the Levites to that of temple servants and gatekeepers. Their duties include guarding the gates and the slaughtering sacrifices of the people, that is verse 11. This demotion to menial tasks once performed by foreigners according to verse 8 has come about because of the Levites' own sin in verse 12. They are now prohibited from the priestly ministry that involved handling the most sacred things of the temple, verse 13. Ezekiel chapter 44 verses 15 to 31, the priests. Because of their faithfulness, the Zadokites are elected to full priestly service in verse 15 and 16 in a composite section. Various regulations about their dress, verses 17, 18 and 19, personal conduct, verses 20, 21, 22, and duties, verses 23, 24, purification after mourning, verses 25, 26, 27, benefits, verses 28, 29, 30 and 31 have been assembled. Within the sacred precincts, the priests are required to wear linen garments, that is verse 17, when compared to the man dressed in linen in chapter 9 verses 2, verses 11, chapter 10 verses 2 and verses 7, and the vestry that is described in chapter 42 verses 14. Priests are required to keep their hair carefully trimmed in verse 20, to refrain from drinking before entering the inner court of the temple, verse 21, and to marry virgins or widows of other priests, verse 22. Their responsibility include teaching, verse 23, and juridical decision making, that is verse 24. Should a priest become unclean by coming near a dead person, he must be ritually cleansed, Numbers chapter 19 verses 11 and 12, and wait on additional 7 days before entering the inner court, verses 25, 26, 27. Priests are to own no land, verses 9 and 28, contradicted in chapter 45 verse 4 and chapter 48 verses 10, 11 and 12. Their income is a portion of the sacrifices, that is verses 29, 30 and 31. Ezekiel chapter 45 verses 1 to 8, the sacred tract of land. These verses detail the dimensions of a 3-part division of a square area of land about 43,750 feet on a side into east to west strips, compared to chapter 48 verses 8 to 22. The northernmost strip is assigned to the Levites, the middle strip to the sanctuary complex and the Zadokites, and the southernmost strip to the city and the people. An area on the east and the west fringes of these strips is allocated to the prince. This idealized scheme places the temple at the center of the reapportioned land in an area separate from the city and the royal dwelling. Ezekiel chapter 45 verses 9 and to 12, the weights and the measures. Verse 9 is a self-contained oracle with its own introductory and concluding formulas. Addressed to the princes of Israel, it warns against violence and oppression. According to verses 10, 11 and 12, the princes are to see the correct weights and measures are honestly regulated. Ezekiel chapter 45 verses 13, 14, 15, 16 and 17, offerings. The two offering ordinances have been combined, detailing the contribution required for the people for the support of the temple, verses 13 to 15, and from the people to the prince, who in turn is obliged to provide for the support of the temple, verses 16 to 17. The original ordinance is most likely the one according to which the people support the temple directly. Ezekiel 45 verses 18 to 25, the Passover, the Feast of Booths. Three 7-day festivals are listed here. First is an annual rite of purification of the temple, verses 18 to 20. Second is the celebration of Passover, verses 21 to 25. Third is the celebration of booths or the ingathering of the crops. Passover traditionally celebrated at the beginning of each year, and booths in the middle of the year become occasions on which the prince offers sacrifices to ensure purity of the community. Ezekiel chapter 46 verses 1 to 7, the Sabbaths. Though the outer east gate is perpetually closed, chapter 44 verses 1 to 2, the inner east gate may be opened on Sabbaths and on new moons and on other special occasions, verse 12. The prince is permitted to enter through this gate to take sacrifices to the doorposts of the gate on behalf of the people remain in the outer court. Listed here are the requirements for Sabbath and new moon sacrifices which the princes presents to the priests, who alone are allowed to enter the inner court to sacrifice to the Lord, verses 4 to 7. Ezekiel chapter 46 verses 8 to 15, the ritual laws. Rituals require that the people enter the temple area by either the north or the south gate, and they leave by the gate opposite the one they have entered, verse 9. The ritual also prescribes that the prince enter and exit in the same manner on non-festive days, verse 10, and stipulates offerings the prince is to take on solemn feasts as freewill offerings and as daily offerings. Ezekiel chapter 46 verses 16 to 18, the prince and the land. The prince's right to the land is strictly regulated. He can give land as a permanent inheritance to his sons and as a temporary gift to his servants. He is forbidden to seize land from others. Ezekiel chapter 46 verses 9 to 24, the temple kitchens. Once again resuming Ezekiel's tour of the temple, chapters 40 to 42, chapter 44 verses 1 to 9, the heavenly guide takes the prophet first to the kitchen on the west side of the temple where the priests eat their portions of the sacred offerings. Next they go to see the 4 kitchens, one in each corner of the outer court, where the laity eat their sacrificial meals which are prepared by the Levites, that is verses 21 to 24. Also not mentioned description of the outer court in chapter 40 verses 17 to 19 and chapter 42 verses 15 to 20. Ezekiel chapter 47 verses 1 to 2, the wonderful stream. Ezekiel and his guide return to the front of the temple where the prophet notices water trickling from below the south wall of the temple, verse 1. As the guide leads Ezekiel through the north outer gate, the prophet sees that the water has changed course and is flowing beneath the south wall of the temple towards the east, verse 2. The farther east the prophet goes, the greater the flow of the water becomes. 4 times the guide measures the water, and each time its depth increases dramatically until it becomes a torrent, verses 3 to 5. Ezekiel sees wonderful trees on both its banks, verses 6 and 7. The guide explains that the life-giving waters of this river that springs from the throne of God will make the salt waters of the Dead Sea fresh and barren placed fertile, and with trees whose fruit is good for food and whose leaves drive sickness away, verses 8 to 12. Thus the measurements of the heavenly guide are finished in this climatic vision of the temple in Jerusalem as a source of a great river that flows out to the east, emptying into the Dead Sea and bringing life wherever it goes. It fittingly concludes Ezekiel's vision of a revitalized worship in a restored temple. The new Israel. Ezekiel chapter 47 verses 13 to 20, boundaries of the land. Inserted between an opening oracular formula, verses 13, and a closing formula, verses 23, is a description of boundaries of the restored land. These boundaries portray no vast expansion of the Israelite territory, but they break the old tribal boundaries by providing land in equal measure to each tribe with little regard to the territory formerly occupied. The northern boundary is fixed as the frontier of Hamath and the pass between the Lebanon and the Hermon mountains, and the southern boundary as Kadesh and the Wadi of Egypt. The Mediterranean provides the western border, and the eastern border is the Jordan River and Dead Sea. The extent of this land is no greater than that held under David. Ezekiel chapter 47 verses 21 to chapter 48 verses 7, the northern portion. Before the distribution of the land begins, notice the resident aliens, like native Israelites, are to have equal rights of ownership, verses 22 to 23, and land is apportioned in equal east to west strips to the 7 tribes: Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Ephraim, Reuben, and Judah. Chapter 48 verses 1 to 8. Ezekiel chapter 48 verses 8 to 22, the sacred tract. The southern boundary of the Judah's territory is the land that is set apart for the Levites, the temple, and the Zadokites and the prince. Ezekiel chapter 45 verses 1 to 8. Ezekiel chapter 48 verses 23 to 29, the southern portions. Below the sacred tract, the following 5 tribes will settle: Benjamin, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, and Gad. Ezekiel chapter 48 verses 30 to 35, the gates of the city. The book closes with a reference to the 12 gates of the city of Jerusalem, one name for each of the tribes, to the city's circumference and to its new name, the Lord is here. Ezekiel is a very challenging book for several reasons. The author uses unfamiliar apocalyptic imagery to describe many things. Like Jeremiah, Ezekiel performed many dramatic prophetic acts, Most of Ezekiel's prophetic acts anticipate the Lord's judgment on Judah. Ezekiel is a message of judgment and a message of restoration. He announces God's judgment against Judah for its sins against the covenant, and he pronounces God's judgment against the surrounding nations which oppress Judah. When Ezekiel upbraids Judah for its gross infidelity to the Lord, some of the language he uses is so strong that it startles us by its harshness. Yet, Ezekiel does not leave his hearers in a state of condemnation but invites them to turn away from their sins and take advantage of God's promises and covenant. Though the Lord uses Ezekiel to chide the people, he also uses him to give hope to his suffering people in time of exile and persecution. Ezekiel is a prophet of judgment and a prophet of renewal. How do I apply this in my life? Ezekiel's entire prophetic ministry centered around the small exiled community of people uprooted from their homes and livelihood, living out their days in a foreign land. We can imagine the feeling of disorientation and confusion that accompanied these people, even though many of the exiles were directly engaged in sinful behavior that led to God's judgment, but they did not prevent them from wondering why all this was happening to them. We sometimes find ourselves in that predicament as well, asking, Lord, why me? And waiting in silence for the answer. The exile had to wait for 5 years for God to send Ezekiel, and when God did, his prophet had a message that the people likely didn't want to hear. God is the Lord of heaven and earth, and the judgment the people were experiencing was a result of their own sin. Ezekiel just reminds us to seek out the Lord in those dark times when we feel lost, to examine our own lives and to align ourselves with the one true God. Let us consider doing so today. May the message from the book of Ezekiel enable us to take things in a stride. May our Blessed Mother, Queen of Prophets, always guide and help us. Amen.